Thank you, Gail, for that warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good evening. My Cabinet colleagues and I are delighted to be here in Wick for the 7th in our series of Cabinet meetings to discuss our country's future. The referendum on the 18th of September is a choice between two futures. The Scottish Government are committed to ensuring that the people of Scotland have all the information you need to make your choice. That's why in the run-up to the referendum, the Cabinet's holding meetings right across Scotland to give you the chance to question us on our proposals for an independent Scotland. But tonight the questions don't need to just be about independence. If you have any questions about any of the things that the Government does for the people of Scotland, then we're happy to answer those too. As well as these Cabinet events, individual Cabinet secretaries are also holding public question and answer sessions on Scotland's future right across Scotland, and so far we've already had 40 of these events. New venues are coming on stream all the time, and if you know anyone who hasn't been able to come along tonight and still has some questions, if you get them to go along to the Government's referendum website, that's scotreferendum.com, and you'll get details of all these future events on that website in the events section, and details of that website are in the packs that are on your chair. In a moment, we'll have the opportunity to hear from the Deputy First Minister, and once she's spoken, we'll be able to have the formal question and answer sessions, and that'll go on for about an hour. Following the formal session, we'll then break up and have a cup of tea at the back of the hall here, where you'll be able to continue your discussions and your questions with individual Cabinet Ministers. But without any further ado, can I please welcome the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, MSP.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe, for that introduction. Big thank you to Gail for giving us such a warm welcome here to Caithness today, and most of all, a massive thank you to all of you for coming along here this evening and joining the Cabinet almost in its entirety here for what I hope and expect will be a very lively discussion over the course of the evening. We are all, my colleagues and I, were all absolutely delighted to be here today. Ever since we were elected to be the Scottish Government in 2007, every summer we have gone on the road. We've gone on tour and taken the Cabinet to different parts of Scotland. The idea behind that, of course, is to get out and about and hear what people have to say, the length and breadth of the country, and to demonstrate to people all over this country that the Government and the Parliament that sits in Edinburgh is not just a Government and a Parliament for Edinburgh or for the Central Belt. It's a Government and a Parliament for all of Scotland. We've all enjoyed getting out and about in that way, and from the start of this year we've been on the road even more regularly. We've decided in this year, this referendum year, it's even more important to get out and about and to hear your views and to take the opportunity to answer the questions that you have about Scotland's future. And I should say at the outset that feel free to ask us any question that is on your mind or important to you this evening. We're now just over 9 weeks away from the referendum on Scotland's future, so if there's a question that will, hearing the answer to which will help you make up your mind, then tonight's your opportunity to ask it of me and of my colleagues. It's a great pleasure for us to be in Wick this evening. Before today, Dornoch had been the most northerly point of the mainland that the Cabinet had reached, so it's really good for us to make it here to Wick. Particularly nice since at least until about 5 o'clock the weather was absolutely beautiful. We've been out and about all day today. We've just had our formal Cabinet meeting, and it's important to say when we bring the Cabinet to these different parts of Scotland, we have normal, formal Cabinet meetings discussing the full range of government business that we would discuss when we're sitting in Edinburgh. But we've also had the opportunity to be out and about, looking at and seeing local projects, visiting some of the projects that the Scottish Government is working with and supporting locally. I think Paul Wheelhouse here has got the record of making it the furthest north today. Paul went to John O'Groats earlier on. Kenny McCaskill visited Caithness Rugby Club to see how young people in Caithness are benefiting from what's called proceeds of crime. That's where money is confiscated from convicted criminals, which is a pretty good thing, I think you would agree, and reinvested into community projects, often sports projects that give young people something to do and help local communities. Alec Neil visited the Pulteney House care home here in Wick. Fiona Hislop, Shona Robinson and I went to Thurso. When I was there, visited the Citizens Advice Bureau and was able to announce a 3-year extension and an additional £2.5 million of funding for our community broadband scheme, which is the scheme that is designed to supplement our main programme to deliver next generation broadband to premises across the country. And it's designed very much to make sure we can get good quality internet access into every part of Scotland, regardless of how remote or rural these areas might be. I know Shona was visiting one of the community sports hubs that are a key legacy of the Commonwealth Games. And of course, the Commonwealth Games get underway in my home city of Glasgow in just over a week's time. There's great excitement about that in Glasgow, and I know across the country. I understand the Queen's Baton made it to Caithness just a few days ago, and I hope many of you had the opportunity to see it while it was here. Fiona got to go to the pictures, the cinema in Thurso. Did you see a film?
I did, actually.
You did see a film. Okay, you can tell us about that later. But to see the success, the story there that is supported by Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And just to prove that there is real benefit in having the Cabinet in your local area, I've got one more announcement for you this evening. This evening I can tell you, and this will be of interest, I'm sure, to everybody in Wick, but particularly perhaps those of you who have children, that the Scottish Government and Highland Council have reached an agreement to regenerate the Riverside play area, which is near the Coghill Bridge in Wick. Those of you who are familiar with that play park will know that the equipment had to be removed because of the poor condition it was in. It had to be removed on safety grounds. So we now have a proposal to replace that equipment. It's a proposal led by Wick Gala Committee, and the Scottish Government is contributing £40,000 to the £100,000 cost of that, and we're delighted to be able to help get that really important facility back up and running for the young people of this area. So these are all the important I think weather permitting, I'm getting to visit it in the morning, but I don't think the swings are back in yet, so it might not be quite as much fun as it will be when the equipment's back in there. The last thing I should say by way of general introduction is to pass on to you the apologies of the First Minister, who is unable to be with us on this Cabinet trip due to other engagements that he has today and tomorrow. I know he's very sorry that he's not able to be here and wanted me particularly to pass on his apologies and to pass on his best wishes to all of you. His absence here tonight, though, gives me the opportunity to steal the line that he always uses at these events, and me and my colleagues get sick hearing it. So for this evening, I get to not listen to this line, but to deliver it instead. He always makes the point of saying the reason the entire Cabinet is here is so that if there are difficult questions from the audience, they get to answer them. And he, which for the purposes of this evening means me, gets to do all of the easy questions. So I'm going to continue with that tradition this evening. If you get tough questions, one of my colleagues will be very happy to have me delegate to them to answer, and all your nice, cuddly, easy ones, I'll be delighted on the First Minister's behalf to step up and answer them myself. Before we get to the question and answer session, though, which is the important part of this evening, the most important part of this evening, I want to take a few minutes to address the topic of Scotland's future and make some remarks on why we believe, and we believe it passionately in our heads and in our hearts, that Scotland can and that Scotland should take the opportunity to vote for independence when we get that opportunity in the referendum in just a few weeks' time. And my first proposition to you this evening is that Scotland can be independent. Often, as we travel around the country, we get asked the question, can we really do this? Is Scotland big enough? Are we strong enough? Are we rich enough to be an independent country? And that's the first question I'm going to address for you this evening. Sometimes, although it's an absolutely legitimate question and a very important question, because unless we can convince you we can do this, we're not going to convince you we should do it. But it sometimes strikes me as a bit of an odd question for us still to be asking ourselves in a country like Scotland, small country, yes, but nevertheless a country that has made such an incredible, disproportionate contribution to the world down the generations. I read a book some years past that I'm sure all of my colleagues have read as well, a book by a Canadian guy called Arthur Herman, entitled How Scotland Invented the Modern World. And when you think about it, that's not too far from the truth. Think about all the inventions and innovations that are famous to us now, from the telephone and the television, tarmac, ultrasound, the overdraft. Not all of them are things we want to boast about. More modern times, Dolly the sheep, one of the greatest scientific innovations of recent times. Grand Theft Auto. How many people here have played Grand Theft? I never have, but my nephew does. But a computer game played the world over, invented, developed here in Scotland. So we're a country that has made an incredible contribution to the world in the past, and I'm sure we will in the future, and yet we still find ourselves asking, have we got what it takes to be independent? Well, the answer to that question, the simple, straightforward, and absolutely true answer to that question is yes, we do have what it takes to be independent. We're a country blessed with extraordinary resources. We are rich in human talent. If you look at what is the standard measure of a country's economic strength, the standard measure of how wealthy a country is, which is our GDP per head, our wealth per head of population. By that measure, an independent Scotland would be the 14th richest country in the world. By that measure, we are wealthier than France, Japan. We're wealthier than the UK as a whole. The UK is number 18 on that list, which is not a bad position to be in, incidentally, but we'd be 4 places above that. And interestingly, when you look at the countries that sit above us in that league table of wealthy countries, you tend to find they are small countries. The Norways, the Denmarks, the Swedens of this world. Now, sometimes when I make those points, people will look back and say, but, that, that good old Scottish thing we always say, but, it's all based on oil. Well, sure, oil is a big, big advantage, big bonus in our economy. We're very lucky to have oil, but our economy is not based solely on oil, far, far from it. We've got enormous strengths in many other sectors: food and drink, modern manufacturing, creative industries, tourism, farming, fishing, and other key growth sectors. We've also got vast potential in renewable energy. We've got quite amazing strengths in higher education and research. We've got more of the world's top universities per head of population than any other country on the face of this planet. I mean, think about that. That's a pretty good position to be in. So it's not all about oil, and don't let anybody ever tell you that it is. One of the big credit rating agencies, the big organisations that determine how creditworthy countries are, Standard & Poor's, published a report a few months ago looking at the prospects for an independent Scotland. And it said, even taking out of Scotland's accounts all of the revenue from North Sea oil and gas and looking only at our onshore income, an independent Scotland would still qualify for their highest economic assessment. So we're a rich country, a very rich country. And the last point on this is that we're not subsidised, no matter what some others would have you believe. Do you know that in each and every one of the past 33 years, that's almost, not quite, but almost as long as I've been alive, well, that's a slight exaggeration, but not too much of one. But in each and every one of the past 33 years, we've generated more tax per head of population than the UK has as a whole. Now, in some of those years, oil prices will have been high. Some of those years, oil prices will have been low, but we've still generated more tax per head of population. And if you look at the last 5 years, our public finances, albeit in a time of economic difficulty and public finances of countries around the world being in less than healthy states, our public finances have been stronger than the UK's to the tune of £8.3 billion. That's about £1,600 for every person in Scotland. So my first message to you this evening is this one. If we choose to be independent, and it's a choice that all of us individually and as a country collectively we will make on the 18th of September, but if we choose our future as an independent country, then we will start life as an independent country with robust public finances and with a strong and varied economy. And that's an incredible foundation for any country to start out its life as an independent country. So my plea to you tonight, and it's a plea from the heart, however you decide to vote, and obviously I hope all of you decide to vote yes, but if you decide not to do that, please, please don't let it be because somebody somewhere has convinced you that Scotland's not big enough and strong enough and rich enough to be an independent country. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could be further from the truth. The issue in this debate, in my view, is not whether we're wealthy enough to be independent. The big issue, the big question, is why so many people in Scotland don't feel the benefit of the enormous wealth that we have as a country. And that goes to the heart of the real debate. Why should we become an independent country? Now, let me say at this stage, very frankly, independence isn't a magic wand. We won't wake up the morning after we become independent to find that all of our problems have gone and all of the challenges we face as a country have disappeared. An independent Scotland will face challenges. We will have ups and downs like any other country does. So it's not a magic wand. And anybody who tries to tell you that it is should be treated with the same disdain as the person who tries to tell you that Scotland is too poor to be independent. What independence is a massive opportunity. It's the greatest opportunity we will ever have as a country to build a better, more prosperous and fairer country for ourselves and for generations who come after us. At the very core, at the very heart of the argument for independence, lies this belief, this conviction, and that is that it will always be better for all of us if the decisions about Scotland, the decisions that shape the kind of country we are taken by the people who care most about Scotland. And that's those of us, all of us, who live here, who work here, who run businesses here, who raise children here. We won't always get it right, but we will have more chance of getting it right because we've got the biggest stake in these decisions than anybody else ever will. Nobody else will ever do a better job of running Scotland than those of us who live here will do. Above all, therefore, a belief in independence is a belief in the ability of the people of this country. It boils down to, are we confident in our own ability to make a better job of running Scotland than others at Westminster? You see, for Westminster, Scotland will rarely be a top priority. Not because they have it in for Scotland, but because MPs from Scotland account for just 9% of all of the MPs in the House of Commons. So it stands to reason the needs, the interests, the priorities of Scotland will rarely be those of the House of Commons. And of course, sometimes, as has been the case in recent times, decisions are taken by Westminster despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of MPs from Scotland, and indeed the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland, oppose those decisions. Think of the poll tax 25 years ago, the bedroom tax more recently. So I want to set out to you briefly this evening just some of the costs to families, to communities and to individuals from Westminster decisions, but more importantly to outline the benefits for communities of having the powers that currently lie at Westminster here in Scotland instead. And I'm going to focus particularly on jobs and public services. You'll know that the Westminster Government has decided to pursue a policy of almost permanent austerity. It wants to cut day-to-day public spending as a proportion of national income to the lowest level it's been since 1948. And the Government of Westminster is not doing that because it thinks that's what's required for the economy. It's doing that because they have an ideological belief in a smaller state, in reduced public spending. In an independent Scotland, we'd have the ability to take a different approach. We would operate within a framework of strong and sustainable public finances. As long as John Swinney's in charge, that will always be the case. But we can choose to invest in public services and reject that Westminster austerity approach. And the current Westminster government, of course, is doing more than just cutting public services. It's privatising public services as well. It sold off the Royal Mail despite huge opposition in Scotland, which may in future, of course, have implications, yes, for all of Scotland, but particularly for people living in rural communities. And we now know that's a decision that's cost the taxpayer about £1 billion because it was sold off at less than it should have been. And there are already fears for the universal 6-day-a-week universal delivery service. We're also seeing privatisation of the health service in England. Health campaigners south of the border are raising real alarms about the privatisation of the health service. Now that's, in my view, a terrible, terrible prospect for people in England, but it will have damaging knock-on effects for us in Scotland too. If private money replaces public money in England when it comes to the funding of our health service, which is presumably what's going to happen, and that leads to reduced public spending for the health service in England, then that automatically triggers cuts through the Barnett formula to public spending in Scotland. So Westminster privatisation will harm the health service and our public services here in Scotland. In an independent Scotland, decisions about spending, decisions about economic policy are taken here instead, and they're taken in a way that suits and meets the needs and priorities of people here. We continue to pay our taxes as we do now, but instead of sending the revenue from those taxes to the Treasury in London and have them decide how much comes back, we keep that revenue here and we determine ourselves the priorities on which it should be spent. And we set out how, with independence, we can make savings of £600 million a year just by not spending money on things like nuclear weapons and the cost of the House of Lords. Instead, we can do things like invest in childcare to make life easier for young families. I want to just say a word now particularly about the benefits to rural communities. We've published today, to coincide with the Cabinet, this document, which I think you've all got copies of, Connecting Rural Scotland. It sets out how, with additional powers that currently lie in Westminster, we can boost tourism and create jobs by, for example, cutting and then abolishing air passenger duty, something that is stifling tourism in our country when we should be trying to do everything we can to grow that sector. It sets out how, with powers over fuel duty, we could look at doing more to address the high fuel prices that do so much damage to our rural and island communities. We can help to increase digital connectivity. I've already spoken about some of the work the government is doing through Next Generation Broadband and the initiative I was announcing today about Community Broadband Scotland. But if we have powers over regulation, we can insist that mobile service providers can do more to improve coverage across Scotland. So this document sets out how we can do so much more if we complete the powers we already have with those powers that currently lie elsewhere in Westminster. These are the big opportunities, just some of the big opportunities that come to Scotland with independence. We can represent ourselves in Europe. If we don't become independent, then we risk being taken outside of the European Union against our will if the David Cameron in-out referendum goes the wrong way. With independence, we can represent our own interests in Europe at the top tables, which will have massive advantages for Scotland as a whole and for our fishing and farming communities in particular. You know, if we'd been independent as a country at the last round of negotiations to determine farming payments and rural funding, we would have benefited to the tune of about €3.5 billion more from the European Union just by negotiating as an independent member state. So these are some of the big advantages that come from taking control of our own future. We can have an economic policy that puts Scotland first. We can make sure that policy is tailored to help us meet the challenges we will face and to build on the massive strengths we have as a country. Success for Scotland, just like success for any other country, doesn't fall into our laps. It doesn't happen automatically. But independence gives us the powers to shape it and to achieve it by using those powers in a way that is right for Scotland. So that's the fundamental reason for independence. I hope I've given you some food for thought tonight on the question of can we do this? And I hope I've helped to persuade you that not only can we do this, but we should do it. When you walk into the polling station on the 18th of September, 9 weeks on Thursday, there'll be lots of issues that will help you make up your minds. We'll hear lots of the detailed questions tonight that are all important. But when the questions have all been asked and they've all been answered to in the best possible way that they can, this will boil down to whether we have confidence in ourselves to take the decisions, use the powers, access our own resources to build a better country for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren. I have absolute confidence in this country of ours and in its people. And if we all have that confidence, then we'll win the ability to be independent and the ability to use these powers of independence to create the kind of country I think we all want to see. So thank you very much again for being here, and it's now over to you.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. We now move on to the formal question and answer session. Joining the Deputy First Minister on the stage, we have Shona Robison, Cabinet Secretary for the Commonwealth Games, Sports, Equalities and Pensioners' Rights. Mike Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education. John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth. Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Culture. And at the back, Kenny McCaskill, Cabinet Secretary for Justice. The Health Secretary, Alec Neil, and Paul Wheelhouse, who's the Minister for Environment. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. There are microphones which will be coming around. We'll take them in batches of 3. If you put your hand up, a microphone will come to you. If you ask your question, I'll take the questions in batches of 3, and then the Deputy First Minister and other Cabinet Ministers will answer your questions. I also have some questions which have been submitted by people who can't be here via Twitter, and I'll try and weave them in as the night goes forward. Now, usually we have far more questions than there are time, so I'd encourage people to get their hands up quickly. If you don't manage to get to your question, then there are forms on your chair, so if you fill in the question you have, and there'll be boxes at the back of the chamber, and every written question will get an answer. So let's make a start, and if folk could put their hands in the air, and if you can say what your name is. We'll start with lady here, gentleman there, yep, and lady here, yep.
Hi, my name's Debbie Gray, and my question is probably for Mike Russell. Research and development and education are key drivers of future economic growth and particularly important for this Highland region. Could you give me a clear position on how you will protect existing education budgets and or increase them after independence? Thank you.
Okay.
Mark Norton, this is a question which really is aimed at one of you who's not present tonight. That's Keith Brown, who is the Minister for Transport. But I'll ask you nonetheless. I've seen some interesting promises made in your literature regarding the investments in the railways, in the Highland Main Line, Inverness to Aberdeen line, Borders Railway, case in point. Given the current situation the Far North Railway line is in just now, what promises and what assurances, indeed, what investment do you plan, particularly for rural railways, including the Far North line?
Okay.
Why is it that no one on the executive team of Police Scotland, including the Acting Assistant Constable for Local Policing North, has any experience actually in the Highlands?
Ask Mike Russell to... Where's Mike here? I'm looking. You're right next to me. Sorry, Mike is here to answer Debbie's question, and then Kenny, where's Kenny? Up here to answer the lady's question here about Police Scotland, and then I will answer the gentleman's question on behalf of Keith Brown, who's a member of my ministerial team at the end there. So, Mike, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I presume you're focused particularly on university research budgets rather than education budgets in general? Education budgets as a whole. The whole of education? Okay. Okay, fine. Colleges and higher education institutions. All universities in Scotland are research universities, or should be research universities. They're also teaching universities. Now, our college system has just gone through a major reform in the rest of Scotland, but we have this, I think it's wonderful and unique structure in the Highlands, and I'm a Highlands MSP, I represent Argyll and Bute, which gives us a unique type of learning institution, which is a federation, essentially, of 13 colleges, some of which have some research specialities and some of which don't. So the first guarantee I can give you absolutely is that there will be no diminution of research funding. We've made that in our higher education research paper. I'm happy to provide a copy of that to you. We intend for the present Research Council funding arrangements to continue. That is, as part of the Research Councils, we contribute something like 8.8% of that money in any case. We also believe it is possible to access research funding from, for example, the European Union in a more productive and aggressive way than we've presently been able to do. And that we believe will add to the research funding that's available. But in UHI, there's a particular issue which is of interest to me. I spent an hour with a new principal just 3 weeks ago at SAMS in Dunstaffnage, which is an example within UHI of an internationally renowned research institute. And I want to see UHI continue to build and develop its research activity right across all its member colleges. Now, in order to do that, what we've got to do is to make sure that they build the research specialities. Presently in Scotland, research funding goes primarily to 4-star research, that is world quality research. It's a little that goes slightly lower. I want to start and just this is sort of raising the hem of the garment of something we're about to talk about in the letter of instruction to the SFC that we do every year. I want to start the process of funding new research and an innovative research that will not have those stars in the Research Excellence Framework, but will move forward. The other issue I suspect you're concerned about is the balance between college and university funding within UHI. Now, when we put through the reform bill, the education, the post-16 reform bill, we put a specific part of that bill that said that the allocation of that funding had to be undertaken in such a way that was agreed with the colleges and with central government. Now, we did that, and I suspect you know, because of a history of difficulty in this matter. So not only is there an agreement that that funding allocation will be made fairly and won't over-benefit the centre at the expense of the colleges, but there's now legislation underpinning that. So in terms of the Deputy First Minister's can and should, in terms of funding for further and higher education in Scotland, independence can provide better opportunities internationally, and it should be the thing that will continue to guarantee the excellence of all our universities, but continue to build the wonderful variety that is UHI.
Thanks, Mike. Kenny, do you want to address the lady's point about Police Scotland?
Yes, well, I think, when we went to Police Scotland, which I think was the right thing to do and we had to do, obviously you couldn't go from 8 chief constables, 10 police organisations down to 1 and fit everybody in. George Graham, who was the outgoing Northern Constabulary Chief Constable, didn't wish to continue serving, but he did in fact become HM Inspector of Constabulary, and I was delighted to work with him. His former deputy, Andy Cowie, actually is currently the Deputy HM Inspector of Constabulary. What we have got is a dedicated Assistant Chief Constable for the North. The first one was actually Derek Penman, and he had been the Deputy Chief Constable of Grampian. He's since retired and was replaced George Graham at HMIC. And the current ACC for the North is Campbell Thompson, who again came from being a Chief Superintendent in Grampian. But to be fair to Campbell, before he became a police officer, he was 7 years on the trawler. So I think he's a fair idea of life, not just in Grampian, but in the North. But who calls the shots on the ground? Because before I came to this and after I'd been at meetings with Caithness Rugby Club, and I was delighted to see that there, I met with the area commander, who was Ross McKillop, who I first met 5 years ago when I'd been in Shetland and he'd been the inspector there, and also met with the current inspector, Inspector Clasper, who's a local guy. So I think what you see is we're getting the best of the integrated services that go with Police Scotland, because certainly what both the inspector and the chief inspector was saying, the benefits of specialist road policing units, the benefits of specialist national rape investigation units, allowing the best standards of practice to be rolled out everywhere, and at the same time we've maintained that local policing where it is a local boy who's now the local inspector.
Okay, thanks, Kenny. And sir, sorry I didn't catch your name, sir. Mark, about the far north line. Keith Brown is not here, the Transport Minister, but Keith sits in my ministerial team, so I'll answer the question for you. I mean, the first thing to say, which I hope is appreciated, that improving journey times and improving services across the entire rail network, particularly on some of the longer distance routes as well as the intercity routes, is a key priority for the Scottish Government, and that priority is reflected very much in the invitation to tender for the new ScotRail franchise, which that process is currently underway at the moment. The Friends of the Far North Line, which you may be involved with, Friends of the Far North Line is an organisation that's been campaigning for additional services on the route for some time. They previously submitted a sample timetable to Transport Scotland for consideration of how to improve the services. There was some high-level analysis of that done, but it was thought that the best way to proceed was through the tender process, given that the ScotRail franchise is currently out to tender. It was suggested to them that they had some discussions with the bidders for that franchise, and I understand some discussions have taken place there. The tenders are currently undergoing an evaluation process, and I would hope we would see a number of improvements reflected in the new franchise period. But because that process is currently underway, you'll understand I'm not going to be able to go into specific details of that. But if you catch me before you leave tonight, I'd be happy to take your details and have Transport Scotland update you as much as they can as that process takes its course over the next few months.
Okay, hands again. Gentleman here, and the lady just, yeah.
My name is Brian. I'm a 75-year-old retired draftsman. I had a great difficulty over many, many months whether I should vote yes or no, and you'll be pleased to know that about 3 or 4 weeks ago I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, right, it's going to be yes. So it was slow in coming, but I'm going to keep to that yes. I had a friend, I didn't have a question myself, but I was at church at the Baptist church yesterday, and my friend wants me to ask a question so I can report back to him next Sunday. Now my friend at Wick Baptist Church wants me to ask a question, sir. He works in the fishing industry at Scrabster as a fishing merchant. If a yes vote is successful, sir, will the Scottish fishing still be mostly ruled by Europe? So if you could answer that, and I'll report back to him. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll do the lady second, Jan. Yep.
Thank you.
Some of the unique cultural heritage of this county and this town, and this part of the town especially, that of many others in the Highlands. Likewise, the road, the canal and railway infrastructures in Scotland that we use today would not be in existence without the foresight of enlightened local innovators, backed by the immense financial collaboration made by the British government in the 19th century. Why then is the Scottish government so determined now to ignore and completely reject this massive contribution to the prosperity of Scotland and pursue in its haste to create independence and separatism? Why not learn from the past and form greater cooperation with Westminster?
Hi there. My name is Magnus, and I'm a Yes voter and SNP member. when trying to convince people on social media, trying to convince people on the doorsteps in the pub of a yes vote, people up here aren't so much concerned about the transfer of powers from London to Holyrood or even Holyrood to Inverness. What people are concerned about is the transfer of powers from Inverness to Caithness. Can I ask what will happen in the event of a... Can I ask what advice you would give us when trying to convince people to say how a yes vote would effectively help the transfer of powers up to the far north?
Okay, 3 great questions, Brian. I'm hoping everybody in Scotland has that middle of the night moment over the next 9 weeks. So fingers crossed. I'm going to ask Paul Wheelhouse, who's here representing Richard Lochhead, the Fishing Minister today, to answer your question, or your friend's question, about fishing and the relationship with the European Union. And then I'm going to ask John Swinney to address the, sorry I didn't catch your name, the point about cooperation and how we ensure the continued investment in infrastructure. And John will also take your point, Magnus, about the devolution of power beyond Edinburgh and Inverness to the communities across Scotland. Paul, do you want to kick off?
Thank you. The first thing to say is that we certainly recognise the cultural and economic significance of fisheries. I represent an area which has significant fishing as well, and obviously the Cabinet Secretary, Richard Lochhead, represents the Murray area, which has significant activity there. What we have at the moment is a situation where Scotland's interests in Europe in terms of the fishing sector are often represented by UK ministers, sometimes ministers from the House of Lords, who have little knowledge, little affinity, and indeed little interest in the delivering a good solution for our fishermen. And Scottish ministers do attend European Fisheries Council meetings, but often have to sit outside the room where the key decisions are being made. We do our best through bilateral engagement with commissioners and indeed with other governments to try and strike a deal that's fair for Scotland's fishermen. And indeed Richard Lochhead takes part in key negotiations on issues such as the mackerel fishery and indeed the annual quota settlements in December. So we do play a role, but that role is constrained by our current position within the UK government. And we would dearly love to be in a position where we could speak directly to Scotland's interests in those Fisheries Council meetings to make sure that Scotland had its unique situation put forward, where we have a mixed fishery, which is one that is often very difficult to deliver some of the solutions that the European Commission has come forward with. But we've had, through the process of working with other governments and some discussion with the Commission, arrived at a position where the sector itself is to be congratulated for having taken forward important conservation measures, which have seen some of our key stocks recovering now in the North Sea and off the West Coast. So we can be pleased that the steps, the sacrifices that have been made by our fishermen, sometimes in the face of unreasonable accusations and requests from other quarters, but they have made important strides, particularly in relation to the cod recovery plan and putting in place mesh panels in their nets, which mean that the young cod can escape. So we've seen a massive reduction in discards of cod. We've seen great progress being made. And that's as part of the kind of regionalisation of the common fisheries policy. We've achieved that success, working with Europe in a constructive way to say, trust us, we know our fishery, we can put in place measures which allow us to recover our stocks. And the commissioners have allowed us to take that. So we're seeing gradually a return of some management powers to Scotland from Europe. And that's been very, very positive, and we're now seeing the benefits of that in terms of stock recovering, key stocks recovering, and we hope to be able to say something more positive about that. But in terms of going forward, clearly we see our future as being a nation within the European Union, and the European Union will still have a say in the management of fisheries, but we want to continue that process of working with Europe to build that trust, to say, trust us, we can manage our fishery, give Scotland the ability to demonstrate we can fish our fish sustainably. And it's in the fishermen's interest more than anybody else to make sure that the fish are still there for future generations, for their sons, daughters, grandchildren to come forward and take part in the sector. So we feel we have a positive message to say to Europe. We feel we are demonstrating positive measures in what we're doing with our industry at the moment. We're working closely with our fishermen and the onshore sector, which is obviously vital to our economy as well. And I believe that we can play a positive, proactive role in Europe, working with Europe to make sure the common fisheries policy is designed to reflect the particular characteristics of our mixed fishery.
Thanks, Paul.
Fundamentally, I agree with Lily's point that infrastructure is central to our economic prospects as a country. And over the last 7 years of our administration, we've attached the greatest of significance towards improving the infrastructure of Scotland and ensuring that it's fit to support our economic development activities as a country. I think one of the problems that we've had to wrestle with, however, is that decisions about infrastructure at one level are taken by us in Scotland, and we can decide how to allocate our capital programmes in the way that suits the interests of Scotland to boost our infrastructure. But fundamentally, the size of our capital investment programme is determined by Westminster. And if you look back to 2010, when the government changed hands, the new Conservative and Liberal government came to office, from that day to this, Scotland has lost about £3.5 billion of capital investment reductions as a consequence of decisions taken by the UK government. And at a time of economic difficulty, the need to stimulate the economy, that is, in my opinion, the most foolish decision the United Kingdom government could have taken, because it harmed jobs, it harmed employment, and it undermined our ability to create the infrastructure upon which economic recovery could be built. And what could I do about it as the Finance Minister of Scotland? What I could do about it was I could ask the Treasury not to take this foolish decision, but I can't stop them. Independence would give me the ability to decide what was the right level of capital budgets to be deployed in Scotland to enable us to, for example, take the improvements. The gentleman was asking there about the Far North Line. We don't improve that without money. We can't improve Berriedale Braes without money. We can't dual the A9. For £3.5 billion, we could have dualled the A9. And that was taken away from us by the UK government's cuts, with which we profoundly disagree and for which there is no support within Scotland in terms of the programme of the UK government. So if we want to be able to design and to take forward a programme of investment in our infrastructure that will meet the needs of Scotland, we've got to be able to determine the size of that infrastructure programme and to take those decisions here in Scotland. And that, for me, is the key answer on infrastructure. Independence gives us the ability to determine our own priorities and to make those choices to suit the long-term economic interests of Scotland. Now, Magnus's point over here about power, this government is a government that believes that the people who live in communities are best placed to determine their own future. We are in the process of taking through Parliament a community empowerment bill, which is designed to essentially rebalance the distribution of power, not between public authorities in our country, but to re-empower the communities. So there's much greater opportunity for communities to own assets, to use assets for the long-term benefit and the long-term development within their communities, and to see those as great advantages and assets that can be used to develop new opportunities in communities. If you look at some of our actions, since 2007, we've taken away many of the constraints on local authority funding so that local authorities have got much greater flexibility about how to deploy resources at local level, not determined by our priorities in Edinburgh. And as a consequence, that's assisted local authorities in dealing with some of the pressures and challenges that they face at local level. So fundamentally, we believe in returning power to communities and enabling communities to have much more ability to determine their own future.
Can I just, before we move on to the next question, just say something else in response to the question you asked? I mean, John's absolutely right about these very tangible, practical points about our ability to decide how much we invest in infrastructure. But you couched your question in terms of the shared history and the achievements of Scotland and other parts of the UK and the British Isles. And there are many, many links between Scotland and the other parts of the British Isles. I mean, something that's perhaps not appreciated enough is that an independent Scotland will still be part of the British Isles. We're not going anywhere. We can still cooperate. So there are many links of the past, links of history, of culture, of family. These things are not going to be broken. These don't depend on whether we're governed from Westminster or not. And similarly, there will be many, many things on which an independent Scotland and other parts of the British Isles will continue to cooperate. You know, we share an island with England. We're going to work together on a whole range of different issues. The key thing is exactly what John's talking about. It's our ability to decide for ourselves the things that are in the interests of Scotland, and also to decide where it suits our bigger interests to cooperate with others, whether that's others across the UK or the European Union or internationally. But fundamentally, that issue of control and decision making, sovereignty if you like, is what rests here in Scotland if we're independent. But you know, these links that we all cherish, my grandmother was English, you know, these are precious links to all of us. They're never going to be broken because they don't depend on who governs us. They run much deeper than that.
Okay, I'll kick off this. I'll kick off this next three with a Twitter question from Caithness Craft, who's asking about passports. Caithness Craft has just renewed their passport and wants to know whether that will be able to be transferred after independence. And then a question from down the front, yep. And the gentleman here.
My name is Ian Bakey. I'm chair of a parent council in the local primary school and also a member of the parent council at Wick High School. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the Cabinet for coming to Wick. It's great to see you here. And it was a great pleasure to host Minister Joe Fitzpatrick at my workplace today. All my staff appreciate your time. I was part of a parent group that campaigned for a new Wick High School. In 2010, First Minister Alex Salmond announced a new state-of-the-art school for Wick with a completion date of August 2013. So tomorrow, Deputy First Minister, you're cutting the turf on a building that you should be walking around. The intervening years have been fraught with delays and poor communication and bad consultation, and consequently the project has increased in price 4% a year, or some £2,600 a day. Would you appoint somebody from central government to be part of the stakeholders group to monitor completion of this project? I'm also concerned that there's been very little educational input from the stakeholders regarding the new school, and I suggest that 2 ex-rectors join the group. They should come on board because such educational input is badly needed. Otherwise, it might be the cheapest school that Highland Council can build and not a state-of-the-art one. The last comment, and it is the percentage of pupils leaving Wick High School in 2013 with 5 hours last year was 6%, down from 7% the year before. This means that only 1 or 2 pupils have access to all of the tertiary education institutions that you spoke about. This doesn't seem fair, and speaking as a parent, if you really believe in a parliament for all, what are you going to do about that? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Ranald McCausland, and I would like to reiterate the welcome to sunny Wick. It's good to the ripple of applause that you heard about the alienation and disenfranchisement, feeling of being disenfranchised by living up here is tangible, and it's nice to see you doing something constructive about that. My question is about a couple of connected issues. One is land use, and the other is rural depopulation. Now, I have no axe to grind as to who should own land particularly. I have a very sharp one to grind as to what they do with it, whether they actually utilise it properly, whether they take care of it, whether they try to husband and improve it in a proper manner, because it is part of our heritage. And the rural depopulation has, over my working life in this county, has been startlingly fast. It's similar to the clearances. Now, there's an absence of joined up thinking. If you look at land use here, we've got marginal land, millions of acres of it. We've got things like salmon in the rivers. We're developing fish farming. which provides very few jobs at the expense of angling, which keeps people on the land and is indigenous and is part of our culture and heritage. There's an absence of joined up thinking. And one of the ways this has occurred has been the centralisation of local government in the far north, because we lost over 250 local government jobs. The argument posed at the time was that it would be cheaper and less people employed to provide those services from Inverness. It turns out that the number of jobs, the increase in jobs subsequent to those job losses is more. And we now have people in Inverness to deal with who've never been north of Dornoch. Mercifully, we can't include you in that anymore. So I wonder if you could address those kinds of issues, the absence of joined up thinking, because the rural population is shrinking, has been under attack for a long time in terms of closure of rural schools, etc., transport. It costs money to keep us here. We're the H in H&I. Our local council don't appear to have twigged that fact, and they haven't joined in with the island movement, quite rightly, to say what's in it for us. So I wonder if you can guarantee we Teuchters a little more peace of mind than we're currently accustomed to.
I feel the need to point out that I think individually all of us have been north of Dornoch before. It's just collectively we hadn't been. So just a point of I'm going to Paul Wheelhouse has very recently taken receipt of the report of an expert group on land reforms. I'm going to ask Paul in a moment to address your very, very important points about land use. I think you were asking about land use as opposed to land ownership, but also I think your very pertinent points around rural depopulation. Mike will address the question about Wick High Street. It was Ian, wasn't it? Yes. I'm very much looking forward to cutting the sod in the new community campus tomorrow, but nevertheless I think you've raised some very important points that Mike will address there, both about the history and the future of that project, but also I think you raised some important points around leaver destinations of people leaving school in Caithness. And Fiona, firstly, Fiona, if I can pass to you. Fiona is the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, and I'll ask Fiona to address the Twitter question, just to show how multimedia we are, on passports.
And for Caithness Craft, the answer to that is we would honour existing valid UK passports until their expiry date. So obviously some people will have had older passports and they'll want to renew them. When they renew them with independence, they can apply for a Scottish passport. But if you've got a current UK passport, we will honour that to the end of the expiry date. And that's also set out in terms of detail, either in passports or in citizenship in the Scotland's Future. And those of you who haven't seen it or looked at it either online, or I think there are copies available here tonight, page 273 of Scotland's Future, the white paper, sets out all the different provisions for citizenship and passports, because quite clearly you've paid for services when you buy your passport, and that will be honoured until such time as you choose to change it, as long as your current passport is valid.
Pick up on Ian's points.
Ian and I have discussed this before, and I hope we're moving in the right direction and not nearly as fast as we'd like to. Can I divide your question into three parts? I think there are three questions that are linked. The first question about why it has taken so long. You know, Ian, and I know people in this hall know, that the question of determining the closure, because it was called in, one of the component parts was called in, was a difficult one. It took an awful lot of thought, and indeed, I think it was one of the more difficult ones that I've considered. But that having been done, our expectation was that there would then be a rapid agreement on the financial terms, and that didn't happen. Now, I think that's regrettable. I think it's regrettable on both sides it didn't happen. I'm delighted that there has now been a final agreement. The difficulty has been something that happens from time to time in Scotland, which is a very high location premium, much higher than the Scottish Futures Trust estimates should be there for the build, and it was very much higher. It required an additional contribution by the Scottish Government of 1.8 million. It has required additional funds from the Highland Council. But that's now been agreed. That's a regrettable delay. I think everybody regrets that delay, but it's been agreed. The building is going ahead, and that's very positive indeed. I hope we've learnt from it. I hope both sides have learnt from it. I've certainly learned from it. I've learned because Gail has been extraordinarily effective in this matter. She has been pushing this very hard with me and with others in terms of the Scottish Future Trust attitude for the last year. And we've now got that resolution. So lessons have been learned. It's regrettable, but it's moving, and Nicola will cut the first sod tomorrow. In terms of monitoring completion, because the difficulty arose in costing the building, I think we've got that sorted now. But I think the question of what happens in the building now becomes the big issue. Now, I'm very happy to ensure that the Parent Council and others have the Services of Education Scotland and others to look at that and to look at, to help the school on issues of curriculum and how it operates within the new building, to look at some of the experiences elsewhere, where you and I can talk afterwards and see how we can put that in place. Because we have to always be open to that. We've just done it recently in a very contentious set of circumstances elsewhere in Scotland, trying to support the parents and the pupils learning in new circumstances. And that brings me to the third part, which is that attainment gap. Now, it's something I've been focusing on very, very strongly in the last year. You probably read quite a lot of the things that I'm trying to do about the attainment gap, because it's a persistent problem in Scotland. It actually appears worldwide that attainment is lower than it should be, particularly from pupils who come from poorer backgrounds. We've had some spectacular success this year in some new projects. There's no silver bullet, but in new projects we've been working on within schools. And I could let you come to a couple of the Pathfinder schools, which have been unbelievably inspirational. Bells Hill Academy, for example, starting focusing on a single pupil in S5, expanding out to 7 pupils, then 10 and 17, with the very, very strong aim of raising the number of higher passes for that cohort up to the average in Lanarkshire. And they're going to succeed in doing that this year in 6 months, which is remarkable. Now, again, I'm very happy to put the school, the Highland Council, in partnership with Education Scotland that's driving this forward on our behalf in this improvement programme, so that we can actually affect those figures year on year. Because the effect of the transformational work we're doing is that those figures can move, because it's the cohort you're talking about is a small cohort. By working on 20, 30, 40 pupils and their families and their parents and their barriers to their learning, those figures could change quite quickly. So on school buildings, we've learned some valuable lessons. It's to be regretted, but we've learned them. On what happens in the wider building, then we need to put you in touch with people, and I'm happy to do so, can help. And on attainment, I think we're on the verge throughout Scotland of some very strong, dramatic improvement in those figures, and I think Wick should be part of it.
Okay, thanks. And finally in this group of questions, Paul, can you address Ranald's questions?
Yes, certainly, and I'm happy to sort of discuss this more with you at the end, because I appreciate time's passing on, but you've hit upon something which is absolutely fundamental. It's about our relationship with land and how it benefits the people of Scotland and the well-being of our communities. And as the Deputy First Minister said, we've recently received the Land Reform Review Group report, which has 62 quite detailed recommendations. It's been a tremendous piece of work. It's certainly a report that sets out a sense of direction that we're supportive of, and we're studying in detail each of the recommendations and the objectives that we're trying to be achieved by the Land Reform Review Group before we come forward with our detailed proposals. But you are right to identify land use as well. We are currently doing work, and it's one of the recommendations the Land Reform Review Group did make, was it needs to be a more coherent approach in terms of an overall overarching land policy which takes account of land use, land ownership and other intervening policy areas which planning system and other areas which impact on that. And we are looking at all of these recommendations. We have not a position where we've decided yet what to do in terms of that specific recommendation, but it is an important one. I would just highlight we are doing some work at the moment looking at how we work with communities in grassroots. 2 regional land use framework pilots are being undertaken in Aberdeenshire and Scottish Borders, and I appreciate that's not an area close to here, but the lessons we can learn from how we work with the grassroots, local communities, looking at how the land is used in their area, identifying how that influences the land use policy in that local authority, and indeed how it influences local development plans and the overarching land use strategy for Scotland is really important. And we are also undertaking work at the point you raised about salmon. We've got an ongoing review of wild fisheries led by Andrew Thin, who used to chair SNH, and I would encourage you to feed into that if you have any thoughts about the future of our wild fisheries. And lastly, just to say that we have, the First Minister's announced a target of 1 million acres in community ownership by 2020. One of the things we have taken forward for Land Reform Review Group is to put together a working group to see how we can achieve that. Why that's important is where we see communities have taken over assets which are perhaps been previously underutilised and suffered a lack of investment. We've seen a quadrupling of the number of jobs that have been taken forward in that area, significant social and economic benefits, including boost to school rolls, population growth, areas like Egg and Gia and other communities. And so it's a very positive experience we can learn from. Not always perfect, but there are some really good examples we can learn from and try and roll that out where it's appropriate across Scotland. And of course, we've got the Crown Estate as well, which is a currently reserved area, but the income from that, as we've given a commitment, income of that will benefit all coastal communities around Scotland and help sustain local jobs and a viable future for our most rural communities.
Thanks, but I'm encouraging my colleagues to be as brief as possible because I want us to get as many questions in as we can, but we're all available at the end if you want to follow up on any of these questions and get a bit more detail. Joe.
Okay, hands up. Gentleman just in front of the camera there, yep. Gentleman just right in front. And haven't had any questions from the far right hand? Yep, go for it. Gentleman here, yep.
In the early 70s, I was in the MOD then, and they had a cost-cutting exercise by cutting the regiments to a battalion, cutting the regiment to a battalion, basically, or a company, sorry. If you go independence, would you reform part of the Highland Brigade as companies? And would you go to the Americans on a lend-lease deal rather than spending billions on military defence? Because I was made redundant 2 years ago due to the fact of these carriers for the MOD again.
Okay.
Thank you.
In the event of you being successful in September, how would the new Scottish Government deal with the festering mess created by Westminster called Lockerbie?
When we get independence, will we be a full member of the ESA, the European Space Agency, or will we continue to buddy up with the UK?
I'm going to ask Kenny to address the point about Lockerbie, if that's okay. And are any of my colleagues volunteering for space? Not to go, but I'm happy to answer it myself if you want. But is anybody who's responsible for space in this government? It's mine. Okay. In that case, once Kenny's answered on Lockerbie, I'll have a go at space, so to speak. And it's a very serious question, actually. And I'll also address the point about defence that came from the gentleman at the back. Kenny.
Well, obviously on Lockerbie, there are many questions that people have raised. As things stand, there is a conviction in a Scottish court that stands, and as a government, we accept that. We've always taken the view, though, that there are issues that should be looked at, but they're not within the powers, and nor should we seek to undermine the current conviction in the legal process in Scotland. That's why we welcome the fact that there's been an application made to the Scottish Criminal Review Commission to seek to resuscitate the appeal. That will be a matter for them, but the position of the Scottish Government is we have always supported the matter being considered by the legal process that we have, which will be for the Scottish Criminal Review Commission to decide whether or not to remit it. If they do, and I think there must be a fair likelihood of that, then it will go obviously back to the courts. But this is fundamentally a matter for the courts. They will consider it, and we always stand by the court's decisions here in Scotland.
Okay, thanks, Kenny. Right, on gentleman's question about the European Space Agency, it's obviously a very serious question, a very topical question. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the first Scottish satellite. We're also expecting, well, this week we're going to see the publication of potential future sites for a potential future space port, and many of those sites are likely to be in Scotland. So this is a really important area. The answer to a specific question about membership of the European Space Agency, we've not been absolutely prescriptive on that because we've taken the view we would want to work in the way that suited our interests best. But you'll be familiar with some research or an academic this week from Strathclyde University who has done some work pointing out the advantages there would be to Scotland in terms of funding if we had separate independent membership of the ESA, and he's quantified that at perhaps 15 to 20 million pounds a year, and enabling us to support an industry that might be worth something like 100 million pounds. So certainly I think there are strong arguments that would say an independent Scotland, perhaps not immediately, but over time, would want to secure our own membership of the European Space Agency to make sure that we weren't losing out on potential funding. But it's a really exciting area, and I mentioned earlier on lots of industries that we can rightfully say we're at the cutting edge, leading edge of in international terms, and it's fantastic to think that space exploration and potential space travel may be another of these areas, and we should certainly do everything we can to support those working in that industry and make sure they get all of the help and support that they need. So it's a very good and very topical question. Sir, your question on defence, I mean, Fiona earlier on pointed to a chapter in the white paper that discusses passports. That same white paper, of course, goes into some considerable detail about our proposals for the defence forces of an independent Scotland, and maybe you take a copy away with you rather than me go through all of the detail of that right now. You, I think, find it interesting to see what we set out in terms of the shape, the size, the equipment that our defence forces would use, and also our relationships with other countries through the European Union, NATO, and of course the international realm. Your specific question about the regimental structure, certainly we were not going back here to as far back as you in terms of the 70s, but more recently when the regimental structure was effectively abolished in Scotland, that was something we were very opposed to, and one of the things the white paper talks about is bringing back the Scottish regimental names and using them in the structure of our army in Scotland, which I think is something that would be very welcomed and very popular in Scotland. But you'll find lots more detail about our defence posture in the white paper, and if you get further questions that arise from that, we'd be happy to answer them for you.
Okay, more questions? Gentleman in the blue jumper, gentleman here, and right in the middle there.
Okay. Good evening, my name is Des Broomfield, and I've heard one or two of the ministers tonight mention Europe in some contexts. What I would like to know is if we become independent and the SNP gain power in the election afterwards, knowing their views on Europe, would they be prepared in their manifesto to give the people of Scotland a referendum on Europe?
Okay.
Okay, my name's Alistair. This is not an independence question, it's a renewable energy question. I'm sure I read something in the news recently that we're putting more investment into helping onshore and offshore wind energy become more competitive or market friendly. I think we've been doing that for a lot of years, since the Scottish Renewable Obligation days, and I just wonder when we're going to stop throwing good money after bad. And also I hear a lot of good words about local democracy. And I feel up here, our local councillors in many instances aren't being listened to. And we've got examples of onshore wind farms being unanimously rejected by local communities, local councillors, and then being approved at national level because it's in the national interests. So I just wonder how you can address these couple of questions, because I don't think we can go on like this.
Hi, my name's Sandra. I'm English and a yes voter. I'm proud to live in a country which is open, fair and progressive, but at the recent European elections, UKIP made great gains, which was extremely worrying. How would the Scottish Parliament combat the scourge of the likes of the UKIP and Britain First and other far-right, extremist, racist, homophobic, xenophobic, sexist, hate groups?
Thank you. Okay. Right, Fiona, do you want to answer the question about our stance on Europe, and you can maybe pick up on the UKIP question as well, and then John, I'll ask you to take on the renewable energy and local democracy point.
Well, we've been quite clear that in terms of Scotland's interests, that we are best served by being an active but independent member of the EU. Most of the countries If you look at Europe in terms of those that have been more recent members are Scotland and very successful. In terms of our interest, jobs, investment, a number of the questions you referred to, projects that we can work collectively with Europe on and infrastructure, the benefits of Europe we think are strong. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need reformed. We've published our own proposals, a whole programme of things that need changed. We've already heard one of the questions about fishing and how it's important to make sure decision making, where we can have subsidiarity and proportionality and regionalisation, for example, of fishing, has to come back to Scotland. So we think we can forge a way that gets the benefits for jobs and investment from EU. There's a number of companies that want to come here and come to Scotland because they see that internationally, whether it's from Korea or other investments taking advantage of renewable energy or different other areas who want to manufacture in Scotland because we're part of the EU, and we see that as being a prospect going forward. We've been quite clear that we think that it's wrong for David Cameron to propose an in-out referendum, because that is the quickest way to make sure we're alienated and isolated and to lose out on that investment going forward in regards to international global companies that want to come here. So we don't think it's in Scotland's interest to have an in-out referendum. We think it's in our interest, and most importantly for the future prospects of our young people, for jobs and sustainable jobs, to make sure we remain part of the EU. So therefore our position as a government, we've made quite clear, is not only would we not want to see such a referendum as an independent country, we don't think it's in Scotland's interest now for there to be a threat, because what's happening now is even the rhetoric or the David Cameron's proposal to have an in-out referendum is causing difficulties. And actually, when I travel internationally, it's not the Scottish referendum that other countries and other firms internationally are worried about. It's David Cameron's proposal to take Scotland and the UK out of Europe, which is causing more difficulty and concern for other countries. And in terms of the European elections more recently, and the issue around the right wing, the blatant right wing, and very, I think, xenophobic approach by some parties, is that actually in terms of proposal, you've got to stand up to racism. You've got to stand up for hatred of any kind, because if you allow people to live off fear, and that's the dangerous currency that you see in terms of some parties, and particularly in relation to challenging. We've stood up and challenged UKIP in terms of what it was doing, and you saw in Scotland that the terms of their vote compared to the rest of the UK, we won the European elections, the SNP won the European elections most recently, and although UKIP did gain a seat, its share of the vote was far, far less than what you've seen down south. And while referring to my first point, my first question, right at the start of this, Joe Fitzpatrick said that what we're facing is a choice of two futures. And when you see a party like UKIP gaining almost a third of the vote in the constituencies south of the border, I think that causes real difficulty, because you're showing a face of the fear of what any government trying to get in at Westminster may do to try and pander to a proposition that might have a populist currency, but at its root has a type of country and a type of values that I think here in Scotland that we reject. And I want the Scotland that we will build is to be one that is inclusive, that welcomes people from all parts of the UK, and indeed welcomes those that want to contribute and work and contribute and pay their taxes and contribute and build that Scotland. We're a country of emigrants. We've got Scots all over, in Australia, in Canada, in the US. We understand that far better than I think than many other people. But I think that when we face that choice on September 18th, it's not just about some of the practicalities that we have, it's about the value system. And I think the points about the European elections and the point about let's build a better Scotland, and let's build one that is based on tolerance and justice and fairness in our society.
Before I ask John to take on the question, Fiona's absolutely right about all of that. You know, just think about this. We've got a vote over whether or not to become independent in September. You know, 6 months, 8 months after that, there's another UK general election. If we don't take the opportunity to become independent, then you can't rule out the possibility that at that UK general election we end up with UKIP in the UK government. You know, I don't think that's what many people in Scotland want to see, and we shouldn't take the risk of that happening. So I saw you wanted to come back on the point about a referendum. Fiona's laid out the position of the government, and you know what we're doing here is being absolutely frank and honest with people. You know, won't surprise you to know, given what's happening at the moment, that we think there's a big place for referenda in constitutional debates. But you have a referendum when you're proposing to change something about how your country is governed or the constitution of your country. We don't propose a change in the sense of taking Scotland out of Europe, because we think for all Europe needs change, we should be in Europe, playing our part in Europe. So we don't say that if we're the government of an independent Scotland, we would offer an in-out referendum, because that's not what we are proposing. But there's a fundamental point here about democracy, because as you rightly made the distinction between the referendum and the first election in an independent Scotland. Now, we'll all be campaigning for that first election to be won by the SNP, but people have the right to choose. And if it is the most important thing to you or to anybody else to have an in-out European referendum, then you'll get the chance to vote for a party in that election that is offering that. That's democracy. So we're not going to sit here and say we're going to offer a policy that we don't agree with, but the fundamental point is that it's for you as the voters, the electorate of Scotland, to choose, and that choice should be made here in elections in the normal democratic way, and that's what independence offers us. John, renewable energy.
Yeah, Alistair's question on renewable energy. The starting point of this, of course, is that we, like many other, well, like all other countries, we have to face up to the necessity that we have to decarbonise our electricity generation processes. And it's an absolute requirement. Our climate change legislation makes it mandatory upon us to take actions to decarbonise. And clearly we have very significant opportunities as a country, given the scale of the wind, wave and tidal energy resources that we have that are there to be captured. So the direction of government policy is to address the need and the necessity of decarbonisation of electricity generation by utilising alternative renewable sources where they are available to do so. The Scottish Government is actively supporting the development of wave and tidal energy. There is around the Caithness coast, in the Pentland Firth, around the Orkney Islands, enormous opportunities for us to develop wave and tidal energy services and resources, and that is exactly what the government's focus of investment is about. There will be other significant aspects of investments which will come from the grid enhancements, and Ofgem have just, in the course of the last week, accepted the need for reinforcement of the Caithness to Murray the establishment of the Caithness to Murray transmission link, which is an essential piece of the infrastructure of renewable energy development in the far north, which will bring with it significant economic benefit. Now, to address the point, I quite appreciate the strong opinions that are held by people about onshore wind. I quite understand the concerns that people express. Some proposals come to the Scottish Government to determine, some are determined by the local authority. On the proposals that come to the Scottish Government, on the basis of what I've got in front of me, there have been 3 applications for large-scale onshore wind farm developments that have been determined by ministers in the Caithness area in the period since we came to office. Spittal Hill was refused, Dunbeath was refused, and Strathy North was granted by the Scottish Government on the information I've got available to me. That says to me that not all of these developments are getting the go-ahead, that they will be tested against rigorous criteria. Some of them are environmental criteria, some of them are about visual impact, some of them are about the wildlife population, the wild bird population, whole variety of tests. And I can assure you that these applications are tested and rigorously scrutinised, invariably by a public local inquiry before it ever comes to ministers. And the ministerial determination that's applied, principally by my colleague Fergus Ewing, but when the developments are in his constituency or where he has a knowledge of an application, I determine those applications. They are given very, very detailed and rigorous consideration based on the evidence that is presented to us in relation to the applications. So not all the applications are getting the go-ahead. Some are getting refused, some of them are getting the go-ahead, but all of them, I can assure you, have been tested against the most vigorous criteria established by legislation to ensure that robust decisions are taken by the Scottish Government. But fundamentally, the move that renewable energy represents is a move to decarbonise electricity generation, which is an unavoidable commitment of the Scottish Government.
Okay, time is against us, so we'll have an opportunity for one more round of questions. People keep it two more? Oh, sorry, no, we've got more time. I'll sneak in. Oh, sorry, signals from the back, it's not helping. People can please keep it very quickly. I'm going to sneak in one question here, which is asking, how will Caithness benefit from the Commonwealth Games? And one question from this side. Gentleman, yep, there, yep, back. And one from this side, gentleman here. Okay. Sorry, and there's a question already got a mic, sorry.
Alan Farker from the Wick Community Council. I'd like to thank the Scottish Government for providing the funding for a new community campus. We're absolutely delighted that it's eventually going ahead. And thank you very much for cutting the first sod tomorrow, Nicola. And on that, on behalf of the Community Council, I'd like to invite you back again to cut the ribbon on the first week in August in 2016.
Yeah. A good quick question, thank you. And the gentleman that's got the microphone over here. No.
Yes, hello, my name's Stuart Young. I was going to invite Mr. Swinney to come to Tesco car park with me tomorrow and look at the windmills from there, but it'd be much more appropriate if you were to visit Alistair's house, where Bailey Wind Farm was consented when there was existing policy which should have prevented it from being consented. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you about that. That's not my question, though. Your policy, your policy of generation by renewables, when you made that policy up, you must have been 100% certain that that energy would be bought by someone. Can you explain how you investigated that and why you made that decision? And will you publish the reasons that you did so?
Okay, the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Jerry McGregor, and I'm also English and a strong yes supporter. My question is a bit more mundane. It's more about the procedure of the workings of Holyrood. I'm really pleased that we're going to be having a written constitution, and hopefully the human rights will also be incorporated into it. It's something that the UK has long been missing. But Holyrood was initially set up more as a subsidiary parliament to Westminster. When we become independent, it's going to have a lot more power, and there needs to be a lot more scrutinisation of the legislation passed and of the MSPs. Are you looking currently, or do you have plans to look at how Holyrood, once independence comes around, will be changed?
Right, okay. Alan, thank you for the invite. I've noticed there is an election between now and August 2016, so on the rather arrogant of assumption, which is not meant to be, that we win that election, one of us would be very happy to come and cut the ribbon. Mike might want to lay claim to it, but you can be certain you'll get somebody. I'm going to ask Shona to talk about the benefits to Caithness of the Commonwealth Games. John, there was a few invites in that question to you, Tesco car park and somebody's house for a cup of tea, but the important question was around renewables and who buys that energy. And then Jerry, it's nice to see you in the flesh. I follow you on Twitter. Absolutely. So I'll then address your question about how the Parliament might change in an independent Scotland. So Shona, do you want to kick off?
Okay, well, I'm really pleased that there's a question on the Commonwealth Games, because with 9 days to go, you can imagine it's pretty much at the forefront of my mind, but you'll be pleased to know that all the preparations are going well and the Athletes Village is looking fantastic. Now, today when I was along at the Community Sports Hub at the rugby ground, folk were telling me what a great reception the Queen's Baton Relay had in the area. And I think that's one of the really nice things, because although most of the venues are within Glasgow, and obviously a lot of the focus has been on Glasgow, the Queen's Baton going around the whole of Scotland into every area has had an opportunity to really get out there and engage people well beyond Glasgow about the benefits of the Games and make people feel involved in the Games. And it was really nice to see the number of shop windows with Commonwealth Games stuff, the flags that have been put out, and the engagement of kids being involved in various activities. So it's been a really nice aspect of the Games to see that. In terms of local benefit, obviously the Community Sports Hub that I visited today is one example of the legacy of the Commonwealth Games. We said that we would deliver over 150 community sports hubs, and a community sports hub is basically a way of making it easier for people to become involved in sport. So the hub brings together all the local sports clubs, looks at providing more opportunities for people to get involved in sport, looks at where the facilities might need to grow and expand, and it was certainly a good discussion we had today about potential local plans for facilities that was within Thurso. I'm sure the same discussion could be had here in Wick. So it's a big opportunity to really focus on sport. And what I want to see is, after the Games have come and gone, and of course they will be fantastic, is that legacy continues and that we could keep sport as a priority. And the good news about that is that the Active Places Fund is a £10 million fund which is going to run for over another year, which gives an opportunity for any local clubs that you're involved in. It's a very simple process, up to £100,000 you can apply to improve your local sports facilities or develop new ones. So if you're involved in something like that and you think that you could improve your local sports facilities through that fund, then it's a very easy fund, can be accessed through the Sports Scotland website. And just finally, on the economic benefits, over 70% of the contracts to deliver the infrastructure around the Games and the services to the Games have been won by Scottish companies, and those are companies that have been spread all over Scotland, not just in Glasgow. So there's been a real economic benefit as well, and many young people have had an opportunity through modern apprenticeships and job opportunities through the Games. So it's not just Glasgow that's benefited, but the whole of Scotland.
Yeah. And Sean, I'm really impressed you managed to get through that whole answer without mentioning the outfits for the athletes for the opening ceremony, which is excellent. John, do you want to pick up the points?
On Stuart's point, I'll talk to Alistair about the development that's been raised, and happy to talk to anybody afterwards about concerns of particular developments, with the one caveat that if there is an active proposal in front of ministers just now, I'm afraid I'll have to not give you any comments on those to keep me on the right side of the ministerial code, which I have to watch myself about. In relation to the contracts that surround renewable energy, these are all contracts that have been entered into as long-term contracts where those producing energy have been provided with contractual commitments which will be sustained as a consequence of constitutional change, because they are contractual commitments that have been entered into and cannot be broken over the terms of those contracts. The reason why I'm confident that this electricity will be purchased is for the first answer that I gave to Alistair's question, that there is a necessity that we have to decarbonise our electricity supplies, and as a consequence of that we have to find sustainable ways of generating that electricity which enables us to support domestic and commercial use of electricity supplies. And you may have noticed just last week an expert group reported on the issues in connection with the electricity market of the United Kingdom, which made the point that I've just made, that those contractual commitments and the opportunities to ensure that renewable energy is supported as part of a market across Great Britain in the event of constitutional change are strong and robust propositions upon which to base our planning.
Okay, and lastly, Jerry, your question about the shape of the Parliament. I mean, you're absolutely right. We've got a Parliament right now that is a devolved Parliament. It deals with a whole broad range of responsibilities. But if it becomes an independent Parliament, then it will be dealing with many more responsibilities. And there are issues that arise from that. Obviously, the Parliament is separate to the government. The Parliament's got its own corporate body that determines the running arrangements for the Parliament and the resourcing of the Parliament. And I know the corporate body is looking, as you would expect it to, at what arrangements would require to be made in the wake of a yes vote. It's doing that from an entirely neutral position, so that the resourcing of the Parliament, what range of committees it might need that it doesn't have now, both to look at the transition to independence and the responsibilities that come after that, are areas of consideration that I'm sure are underway. Sometimes there's more fundamental issues raised, like should an independent Parliament have a second chamber, a revising chamber? Should it have more MSPs? Something that I'm not entirely sure would be popular with very many, if any, people. We don't propose any changes of that nature. But as you say, if we become independent, then we propose a written constitution, and we propose a very open and collaborative and people-led process to devise a written constitution. And questions like that would be perfectly appropriate for the Constitutional Convention that would take that work forward to look at and to consider and to come to conclusions on, so that we, as an independent country, would have a Parliament that was entirely fit for purpose, both in terms of its role in holding the government to account, but also its primary role in representing people from every part of Scotland. But that opportunity to draw up our own written constitution, to decide what kind of country we wanted to be enshrined in that basic foundation law, is one of the many, many exciting opportunities that we get as a country if we vote yes in September.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the clock is against us, unfortunately. So thank you all very much for what has been a very interesting and diverse range of issues. We've covered some very local Caithness issues, some national issues, some international issues, and we've even touched on intergalactic issues. I hope you found it as interesting as I have, but can I remind you that the discussions can continue at the back of the hall over a cup of tea. Cabinet ministers will all be there to continue the discussions and have a chat with you. As you're leaving, there are copies of the white paper as you leave, so if anybody hasn't got a copy, you can collect a copy on your way out. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you all on behalf of the Deputy First Minister and the Cabinet for coming along and for such an interesting session. Thank you.